Thank you, Rakesh. As always, when I come to India, I learn more than anything I would ever speak about as an authority. So that was a wonderful reminder of India's long participation in UNESCO. So UNESCO is one of the most powerful arenas where archaeology reaches worldwide attention, and yet archaeologists themselves are seemingly invisible in the political processes, governance, and public profile of the organization. That seeming invisibility, however, masks a substantial archaeological network of field projects. I work on a World Heritage site, I've worked on many, in fact. Practitioners around the globe, consultants who make money out of World Heritage, site evaluators, conservators, training projects, and university courses around the world. Archaeologists and conservators in India are very well known internationally through the World Heritage arena. You only have to think of Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the work of the ASI there. So I've always, as a scholar, had an interest in the politics of archaeology globally, but this specific research into World Heritage began in 2010 during UNESCO's annual meetings in its Paris headquarters. And these sessions, the World Heritage Committee sessions, happen every year. So as I said, there's a huge outpouring of scholarly work on UNESCO now, particularly the 72 World Heritage Convention, and that traverses a whole lot of different disciplines from international law, economics, policy, tourism studies, international relations, and anthropology. Much has been written about UNESCO, I think, that fails to capture the complexity or even the structure of the organization or the shifting power brokers on the World Heritage stage. And I think what happens is that because so much is available online and on the web, that many people just rely on the documents and what's produced online, these particular sources. And sometimes what I argue is that masks the substantive political issues, which are often sort of occluded as just being technical ones. I suggest that as scholars we need to study up, particularly archaeologists, because the fate of our sites and the people around them, most importantly, is being decided. So I suggest that being there, being in the room, is essential to track the global machinations that are playing out today in this new world order of things. And I think one common mistake that we all make is that we typically presume that power largely resides in these buildings, this UNESCO Paris headquarters, and we have critiqued the organization as a whole in the most general of terms. As an intergovernmental agency and part of the UN family, it's actually, as I mentioned, the states parties or the nation states that are signatories to the convention, those committee members that are the most powerful decision makers. Today, state-appointed ambassadors and politicians, rather than many cultural or natural heritage experts, dominate these national delegations. So the committee is the actual body responsible for implementing the 1972 World Heritage Convention. It has the final say on whether a property is inscribed on the list, or it decides whether the state of conservation of already inscribed properties is okay or needs more work. It takes action if it's deemed necessary, makes recommendations. And it also importantly decides about the inclusion or deletion of properties on the World Heritage List in danger. And we've seen that with Iraq, Syria, and Mali. So this group of countries, this 21, is immensely powerful. The notion that World Heritage sites are commodities that mobilize national and international flows, of course, would not be surprising to any of us in this room. Media campaigns like UNESCO's, using UNESCO branding India, for example, here are incredibly successful, very evocative, very powerful. So the ancillary effects of listing, indeed the supplements to heritage, according to these diplomats, outweigh old-fashioned Eurocentric notions of universal value, authenticity, and integrity. And there are issues with those terms and what they mean, and we could talk about that later. Another notable trend is that collective decision-making and the overarching responsibility for the conservation of sites, once seen as the remit of national delegates with heritage expertise, has been replaced by this sort of excessive backstage lobbying by politicians and the bargaining power of certain nations with geopolitical alliances. And as I said, they can be based on geography sometimes, religion another time, trade partnerships we've shown are very important, old colonial relationships, even more important, or just anti-Western sentiment. So the idea of collective responsibility, both ethical and fiscal, which was once very central to the idea of the convention, is losing ground. State parties aggressively petition for support before and during the meetings. They circulate documents, and they want international alliances that are cemented prior to their properties being presented for debate. So what I'm suggesting is there's been an emptying out of the substance of heritage, leading to a lack of informed debate and transformation where the materiality of things is reduced to their sign value and ultimately their potential political exchange value. So in these committee sessions, sites have become ciphers, I would argue. And this reduction is in part influenced by the manner of their delivery. This is some of the advisory bodies who often present these very descriptive, highly specialized accounts of nomination dossiers, as we see here. One example of this was Palestine's first very controversial site inscription in 2012, which was the Church of the Nativity, which was strongly supported primarily by Christian nations, including Russia and France, rather than strictly Middle Eastern countries, as you might expect. In the case of Panama, we saw very vocal support by countries like Qatar and South Africa in 2013. The site of Old Panama was being threatened by construction of a vast maritime highway, which sort of now encircles the entire site around here. And it should have been, or could have been, inscribed on the World Heritage List in danger. Now that didn't happen, and again it was discussed a few days ago, and it didn't happen. So this has all been built, and it's going ahead. And Qatar and South Africa were very, very outspoken, but they have no obvious regional religious connection, but they do have economic ties that center on the Panama Canal. And about a week after the decision not to declare this a site in danger, trade agreements with those nations were announced. So in this scramble for sites, what's been forgotten is the primary task of the convention, namely the long-term conservation of those sites. So it was always a convention to save sites, not just to list them and list more and more, and so on. We can see just how many properties inscribed on the list are already threatened by infrastructural development. You've probably seen the extensive media coverage of developments in Venice, for example. Everyone thinks that infrastructural development issues are problems of Asia or Latin America or Africa, but in fact Europe is, we have found, is the worst offender, though not often said in those terms. So Venice, this is to make way for massive cruise ships, over 40,000 tons, and the burgeoning tourist economy that goes with them. This was declared a World Heritage Site, Venice and its lagoon, so all of this is supposed to be protected, in 1987, so very early on. And these developments will threaten the fragile natural and cultural setting. And even before further development was aired, Italian architects worked with people from the World Heritage Center to try and visualize one projection of the astounding pace of development occurring in and around Venice. So this is what it may look like in years to come, if this is the future of Venice, if we have rising waters due to global warming and unhindered development. So people have said it looks a little like Dubai, but it is a rather staggering projection. And it was discussed this year, but it was not put on the World Heritage List in danger. And one very powerful and active bloc has been the BRICS group, which consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They, as a group, have their own development bank. There's a special unit designed to increase their UN influence, especially at UNESCO, and are now being held up by Russia as the anti-G7 prototype, so as to maintain economic security independent from the United States and the European Union. So they have been, on the committee, a very powerful group. Not so much now because those seats rotate every 4 years, but when this group are on together, we will see we will see the impacts of that. So in this World Heritage arena, we know that there have been sustained attacks on the advisory bodies and their recommendations, perhaps not to inscribe a site or to put it on the World Heritage List in danger. And there's a kind of revolutionary politics at work. But it also reveals a dissatisfaction by many countries of the processes of inscribing and conserving World Heritage, of countries not wanting to have their sites be judged, rather wanting to list more sites regardless of conservation or outstanding value, or what some European evaluator thinks of their site. And archaeologists too are really very skeptical of these categories. You know, what is authenticity and what is outstanding universal value? Who can make those decisions? In other analyses, we can also look at how high-profile countries are, how influential, how well-resourced, and so on. And so trying to use these suite of techniques, I think, can provide an effective statistical measure of the tensions we see emerging in the World Heritage arena. So in this first table, you can see the polarity of positions by comparing what the advisory bodies' recommendations are on the left-hand side, down here, and then the final World Heritage Committee decisions in 314 cases from the last decade. And here it's worth noting, as I've circled in red here, there's only 7 cases where the final committee decision is lower or more negative than that of the advisory bodies. So everything is pushed towards inscribe, is what I'm trying to get across here. And then when we examine decision-making from 2008 to 2013, it's clear that the final decisions taken by the World Heritage Committee have been more divergent from that recommended by the advisory bodies for referral, deferral, and non-inscription. Again, even more polarized. For example, if you focus on that left-hand column with the very high percentages, 97% to inscribe, 91% to refer. So what that means, if we look at, say, a year like 2014, almost half of the recommendations by ICOMOS and the IUCN, so for culture and nature, they're overturned by the committee members. And so a record 81% of all nominated sites were actually inscribed on the list. So countries are not really listening to the expert opinion. They don't really mind. They don't care what's said. They will get their sites through regardless, whether there are conservation issues, political issues, whatever. So I hope to have demonstrated quite clearly that the overall trend in recent years is to push all final decisions towards this category inscription. So from referral to inscription, from deferral to referral, or even jumping a level and going to inscription. In almost every case, there's complete agreement when the advisory bodies and the committee, when the advisory bodies say to inscribe a property. So they say the IUCN or ICOMOS has done a wonderful job when their recommendation is to inscribe, but they've done a terrible job when the decision is to refer. These are all the same people. So in this graph, we're just looking at those other expert recommendations instead to defer, refer, and not inscribe. And here we can see a dramatic decline in the past decade. So we can see the real level of divergence and disagreement between the World Heritage Committee, those state parties, and ICOMOS and the IUCN. So here I want to show you a network analysis that maps the relationships between countries nominating sites to the list and the responses offered by members of the World Heritage Committee over the last decade. In this chart, we're specifically looking at all the instances where the advisory bodies have decided to defer a dossier in the last 10 years. The red circles represent the countries nominating their own properties. So you can see France, the Philippines, Bahrain, and India. They have very large circles, meaning they have many ties or many other nations that have intervened to speak publicly about their nominations during discussion. The blue squares represent members of the committee who have intervened, and in particular, in this analysis, they have agreed with the experts. So these countries here are the only ones that seem to agree with the expert decisions. So they do not want to support inscription for these properties at the time. You could say that they're rule followers. Interestingly, they are sometimes called the neutral countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Estonia, Australia, and the UK. I think perhaps I would say Australia has been less neutral since we've had those issues with the Tasmanian rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef. So if we move this analysis forward a couple of years, maybe Australia might drop off a little there. So these things are very fluid, and as I said, they're always dependent on the interests of the country. What's interesting, remember too that the countries on the committee are only there for 4 years, then they rotate off. And even more extreme, the Scandinavians follow a self-imposed rule where only one Scandinavian country at any one time serves on the committee. So that also changes the dynamic. The Swiss also, I think, fall into that category as well. So that's why they are often thought of as rule followers. It's another reminder that most signatories to the 1972 Convention are just seeking site inscription. They are not happy with the work of these advisory bodies, ICOMOS and the IUCN. They're also critical of the World Heritage Centre. They're very vocal about that. Indeed, the whole notion of expertise, who has it, where it can be secured from, is now up for grabs. One might say that conservation is not the priority anymore, but rather international recognition, the possibilities for greater infrastructural development, and the political economy of branding. I think most nations, think of Myanmar coming out of isolation, and I'll talk about this in a minute. Most nations desperately want World Heritage status, perhaps more than ever before, and they're finding alternative routes to having their national ambitions met. They're doing this multilaterally. So you could say that this is actually a very good example of the United Nations. By this I mean working together for joint aims, but it is proving more deleterious for World Heritage properties. And if you think about also the neighbouring communities who have most to lose or win in the scramble for World Heritage. But the credibility of the convention, many delegates are talking about the credibility being under threat. And so much so that UNESCO DG, Director General Irina Bokova, appealed over many years to halt this rush to inscribe more and more sites on the list, sticking to less and less criteria each time. As she says here, World Heritage is not a beauty contest. But I think that's exactly what it's become. In fact, cynically following Bokova's lead, state parties are even adopting her language about the importance of heritage for intercultural understanding, for peace building. They're drawing on her speeches from the crisis of heritage destruction in Mali, Syria, and Iraq. And we see this as a coordinated strategy deployed by many nations on the committee. We need to move from the clash of civilizations to the joint heritage of civilization, unquote. In another, they called upon the committee to uphold the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Hague Convention, and others. And the United States also brought out a Native American representative so that they could attain their inscription, even after they've crippled UNESCO with their financial withdrawal, now of many hundreds of millions of dollars. So you can say one thing and do another. And in 2014, Myanmar got its first World Heritage Site, regardless of the many issues that were raised about the conservation, about the archaeology, but because of international goodwill. The committee's decision to inscribe the Pew cities had very little to do with its ancient or archaeological components, but more about Myanmar's participation in world government, its nascent democracy and development, and the timing of this international recognition. So Myanmar was being rewarded for transitioning out of isolation and becoming a member of the club. So using the language of peace, committee members are co-opting that originary vision of UNESCO for their own strategic ends, for political connection, for solidarity, and successful site listing. So sites are pawns, emblems, or tokens that leverage other things, like do we really care about the substance of the site? No, the fact is Myanmar is coming onto the international stage, and that's what we are inscribing and valuing. So these World Heritage properties, it's not so much about them, but it's the process of inscribing them that produces a marketplace for international trade and exchange.
When the 72 Convention came into force, the original motivation, and think in the 60s of Abu Simbel and saving those incredible Nubian monuments and the flooding of the Nile and the dam that was being created, the idea was to conserve these imperiled sites through international assistance, whereas globalizing effects of conservation today generates more far-reaching corollary rewards than in seemingly, and also in seemingly unrelated areas. So whether driven by the commercial interests of states and their blocking of negative decisions, or by layering this language of peace and multiculturalism over any problems with conservation or marginalized communities, the effect is the same. Care for people and places has become of secondary importance to nation states. So the 1972 Convention concerning the protection of world cultural and natural heritage is considered a near universal instrument for the preservation of global patrimony. Inscription is largely regarded as a viable driver for development, peace, and intercultural dialogue. So the Convention is obviously facing challenges, not to mention on the ground, but also its funding, its expert credibility. It remains one of the most powerful mechanisms for countries and communities to showcase their particular historical achievements to the wider world, something that Rakesh mentioned earlier. These threats, but in conjunction with mounting pressure on the World Heritage Centre from members of the committee and state parties, comes at the very time when those nations are pushing more vigorously for site listing. So this escalating desire for recognition and inscription has shaped the World Heritage Agenda and recast UNESCO as an agency for global branding rather than global conservation. This is my argument. World Heritage status, achieving it, keeping it, regardless of what you've done to the site, has become big business. World Heritage sites, their nomination, inscription, monitoring and conservation further leverage and consolidate international relationships, strategic partnerships, think of the Panama Canal and these world views. And their political transactions where cultural recognition both mask and enable a multifarious network of exchange values. So today, heritage is less important for what it is than what it can do. And it's becoming a pawn in our global patrimony. So the examples I've shown you today from Panama, from Italy, illustrate that civil society often chafes against the impositions and oppressions of their own state governments. I mean, let's not think that always our state is the organ that speaks for all of the interests of its people. There are obviously much higher agendas at work. But in other instances, World Heritage recognition might signal new possibilities for citizenship, sovereignty, and statecraft. And I give the examples Palestine and Myanmar, what they might suggest. But none of this exists today outside the frame of global politics writ large. And I think we as scholars, and as archaeologists, this is the most daunting stage upon which our work reaches the world. And despite it being an institution in crisis, UNESCO, continues to produce enormous numbers of documents and web pages. I would encourage you to look at its vast web sources. They produce documents, declarations to protect and preserve, to promote rights, development and sustainability. But of course, the most powerful decision makers in World Heritage have their own agendas. So since the end of the Second World War, as we mentioned right at the beginning of our presentations, the international community has sought to establish and maintain institutions that govern its common affairs. The area of global heritage is no different. While such institutions may take many forms, by far the most important has been these formal international agreements through which countries bind themselves together under international law to negotiated commitments. So the competing political and economic interests that we see today, whether we're talking about climate change or nuclear proliferation, they're no different to the dynamics that we see playing out in the sphere of culture. So over the past 40 years at UNESCO, cultural heritage has been part of this elusive hope for a better world, this sort of well-intentioned hope. But I think the convention is not so much about protection anymore, but about branding, marketing, and promoting new nominations, new site inscriptions in an increasingly acquisitive heritage economy. So whether you use the language of nation-state sovereignty or world peace, well, it really does sound like that it is the Miss World contest, a beauty contest, the result is the same. So I suggest that we as archaeologists and heritage scholars have to educate ourselves to the political economies at work in our research, at our sites, in our host nations, and amongst our many communities. I thank you very much for your attention.